Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this HEPI UCAS webinar. It's the third year running where we're privileged to be able to host Clare Marchant, the CEO of UCAS. My name is Nick Hillman. I'm Director at HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, and I'm talking to you from our offices in Oxford today. We've had unprecedented demand for today's webinar, so I'm not going to say much because I know people want to hear from Clare as quickly as possible, and so she has as much time as possible. But just to let you know the format of today's session, first we'll hear from Clare for 10 or 15 minutes to so that she can say the most pertinent points that she thinks people in the universities and schools and colleges world need to know about this year's university admissions and results round. Then I will put a very small number of questions to Clare, and then we'll open it up and we'll let the audience put their own questions to Clare. So please do submit those in the Q&A so that we know you have questions, and please upvote them as well so that we know which questions are of most interest. And we will then ask people to ask their own questions. We'll turn on your microphone and you can ask your own question. And if the tech doesn't work, then I'll read out your questions, obviously, for you. We do have a hashtag this morning. It's Results Day 2022. It is all being recorded, and we'll make the recording available afterwards. There are media present, so every word is on the record. So please bear that in mind. But with no further ado, I'm going to turn over to Clare. Now, many of you will know Clare from her many appearances and her leadership at UCAS. But for those who don't, she's been at UCAS since 2017. So this is her 6th round. And we were just ruminating before we went live on how many ministers she had dealt with during those 6 years. And before that, she worked in local government as the chief executive of a large local authority. So Clare, with no further ado, over to you. The newspapers this morning are absolutely full of all sorts of speculation. I wonder if you're going to bring us down to earth and tell us what it's really looking like.
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you very much for having me. I think probably what I will do is take us through 5 sort of elements today. 3 things that we know as we sit here the Monday before Results Day, and 2 things that look ahead to clearing post-Results Day, but also beyond 2022. So I think I'll start with the demand for UKHE. I'll go on to some of the offer making that we have seen over the spring, which has been precise and cautious and a credit, I think, to the UK higher education sector. And then I'll go on to what we know that students are telling us in terms of their sentiment, because that must be the most important thing as we go into Thursday. Those students, those parents, guardians, teaching advisors that are supporting them. And that's certainly UCAS's focus over the course of the days and the weeks to come. So I'll touch on those 3 things, and then I'll come back to perhaps what we've seen from Scottish Results Day, what we're seeing clearing and thereafter. So firstly, in terms of UKHE, I think it's an absolute delight that we're sitting here within the UK higher education sector, and we're seeing real record demand for UK higher education. It is really a sign of our world-class education sector that we've got that record demand. So if we take some of those stats we saw at the end of what we call the main cycle on the 30th of June, and we look at that entry rate, that application rate for UK 18-year-olds, that 44%, I think that's really to be celebrated, and particularly those from a disadvantaged background. So I think that's something that we know, and we know there's more 18-year-olds in the population, but we know the application rate is ever increasing. We also know that for international students, that's also a positive picture. If we take it overall, it's around 3%, but if you look outside of the EU, it rises to 9%. The couple of comments I have that, and I might return to this at the end, is as we go through the coming years, of course, that increased demand that we're seeing needs to be matched by the ability to navigate different options beyond just the traditional 3-year undergraduate degree. And I think there is something in there for all of us to ponder on and think about as we go into future years. So I'm pleased that we're sitting here in a year where we have record demand. I think what we do know, and this started really back in January, is that offer making has been precise, cautious, conservative from universities, and rightfully so. So if you think back to January, which feels an awful long time ago now, but that off-call announcement about the midpoint in terms of grades, that was really helpful for universities because they knew as they went through the offer making period over the spring, what they were, the sort of, I suppose, the rules of the game within which they were playing, this midpoint between 2021 and 2019. At a macro level, we've seen that reduction in offer rate broadly from 70 to 65%. But within that, we've seen particularly what we call most selective institutions, so the most competitive institutions, reducing around 5% as well. And within that, we've seen some of those cap courses like medicine, like dentistry, also reducing their offer rate. Now, that is to the students' advantage because, of course, as the students have been going through the spring, they've had their potentially up to 5 choices and they've had those offers coming through. So perhaps any disappointment they might have felt by only getting 3 or 4 offers has been felt early on. So they've had more certainty as they've gone through the cycle because universities have behaved, I believe, responsibly based on the data that they've had to hand. What we also know in terms of offer making is in terms of the students' response to that, they've been pretty savvy. So we've saw at UCAS lots of use of extra, which is the ability to add an extra choice, and late in the cycle them taking up some offers and changing their minds. So using some of those digital tools that are available to them. You know, at the end of that point in the cycle, the fact that over 97% of them have got at least one offer, again, is a good sign of the choice available and the fact that most students are still this year in the driving seat. I think the other thing to look at in terms of offer rate is in the context of that slightly more cautious offer rate, actually what's happened to those disadvantaged students. And we know proportionally the most disadvantaged students have effectively been put first in this whole offer making piece. So that offer making rate has dropped less proportionately for those disadvantaged students as opposed to advantaged students. So that's another thing to bear in mind as we go through. And of course, that's in the context of this year being probably the first real summer that we've seen the use of that individual free school meals data that we made available during the course of early summer last year. So I think offer making we know as being more conservative, but what do we know in terms of what students are feeling? And for me, that's always the most important thing. And you know, at UCAS, we survey thousands of students each year, but we do it in a very timely way. So we've done some surveys in the spring, but even the early summer, which has given us some indication of how students are feeling. So when we surveyed them back in late spring, 95% of students were saying they were feeling confident about progression to UKHE. And actually, we know that half of them saw exams as the best way of assessing those, and only just over 10% of them saw return to teacher or centre assessed grades as the best way. So again, an indication that they felt this was broadly going to be a fair year. Obviously, since then, they've taken exams, usually stressful in any year for a cohort of students, but particularly where they're taking them for the first time as this cohort is. But even when we got to early summer, we again surveyed them back in June, late June, and we saw nearly 2/3 of them were still confident, not only just about progressing to higher education, but progressing in getting either their firm or insurance choice, which again, I think is a good indication that students are confident about progressing and looking forward to progressing. We then do quite a lot of surveying as students interact with UCAS.com, so that's real-time surveying. And again, degrees of confidence even in the last few weeks, but some anxiety. Again, I would say that is not unusual. Any year will have anxiety, and there's no more levels of anxiety we're seeing this year than any other given year. I think the other thing that we certainly are seeing, and this is one to bear in mind, I suppose, as we approach Thursday and beyond, is we've specifically asked students around cost of living. And that is something, whether it's accommodation costs or grocery costs or course material costs, that we are going to track as those students start university or college in the autumn. We know 70% of them are already thinking about a part-time job. We know that we're tracking travel time that they're looking for, and whilst that increased slightly during the years of the pandemic, it has slightly dropped off. And so whilst they're not necessarily looking to stay at home in greater numbers, they are potentially looking to stay closer to home. So that's also something to bear in mind. What we're also hearing is quite a lot in terms of students looking to use clearing. So again, as we're tracking their use of UCAS.com, we're seeing them saying, you know, large percentage, nearly 40% saying they're going to use clearing. So that's all of what we know. If I turn to two things that we've found out in the last 10 days, and perhaps that tells us more about what will happen Thursday and beyond. Well, obviously last Tuesday, myself and colleagues were up in Scotland, visiting universities there, listening into some of the calls that were being taken by university admissions professionals up there. So what did Scotland tell us? It's a very different educational landscape, and I should throw a lot of caution into making direct comparisons. But I think there are some things that it told us that are relevant to what might happen on Thursday. And we saw record numbers of students, just over 60%, who were getting their first choice. I would expect us to be sitting in a place on Thursday. We either have record or near record levels of students in England, Wales and Northern Ireland in the same position getting their first choice. We also saw some things almost bespoke to Scotland, because of course they've done a lot of work on their gender action plans. There's some positive news in terms of that, but also broader in terms of widening access in Scotland. It was a positive news in terms of progression. And I think that's one to watch as we move forward. Certainly in the 2023 cycle, as opposed to this one, the addition of widening participation questions about care leaver status, estranged student status, whether you're a veteran, whether you're part of a forces family, I think will really help in this regard as it becomes more acute to really make a difference in widening access and participation. However, what I would say, and those of you who read some of the Scotland press last Tuesday would appreciate, is that a return to either an intermediary position or, as Ofqual have said, a midpoint was never going to be pain-free. And I think we would kid ourselves to say that that is going to be pain-free, although necessary to do. So I think there is lots of positive news in terms of potentially looking at record or near record students getting into their first choice. But similarly, we all know that a return to midpoint is something that potentially needed to be done, but is not easy. And everybody that I've spoken to, be it in government departments, be it in regulators, is working to make sure that through all of our social media messaging, that support is around. We also know from Scottish Results Day, it is going to be a very active clearing. It has been in Scotland. We know as we sit here today, around 28,500 different courses in clearing. We know selective institutions, significant numbers of those offering courses, even in some of those competitive subjects like law and psychology. I thought I'd take the opportunity, whilst everybody will be focused on Thursday and what happens this week and thereafter and the very short term, to also just point to what we might see in years ahead. As you may have heard, UCAS have done some forecasting and forecasting through to 2026, which will continue to iterate through to 2030 as we go through the years, which sees, I suppose, a three-pronged move to potentially move from just over 700,000 applicants to nearly 1 million. And that's driven by the demand I started off talking about, the demographic increase across the UK, albeit at different rates, and that international demand, which I referenced. So what does that mean? Why are we pointing to that forecasting? Well, certainly we are seeing increased demand all the time for degree and higher apprenticeships. Nearly half of the 700,000 that registered with UCAS expressed an interest in apprenticeships. Making those alternative routes easy to navigate for students, I think, is absolutely paramount moving forward. The second thing is, you know, in a much more competitive landscape in years ahead, who are the students that are most likely, or there is a risk of the likelihood of them losing out, is those that haven't got their support around them. And so those disadvantaged students are all focusing through access and participation plans, and some of the work UCAS is doing on outreach engine and widening participation questions, really, really important. And then thirdly, and you know, something that's a real focus for us this year, but will continue to be a focus in UCAS, is putting some digital tools in the hands of students. So one of the things we're seeing this year, and I expect to continue through innovation in years to come, is really active use of Decline My Place, which we introduced 2 years ago, of things like Clearing Plus, which you then are able to match through to. So I am positive both about this year and about future years, but they are not without risk. And that's where UCAS and the organisations it works with have every duty to support those students as they go through what is always, you know, a very difficult set of choices and, you know, big life choices over the coming days and weeks. I think I'll probably finish there. There's loads more I could say, Nick, but I know you'll have loads of questions covering loads of other different things.
Well, thank you so much, Claire. And in fact, the questions are coming in thick and fast, and I will turn to those in a moment. And do remember to upvote the ones you'd most like to see asked. But I'm just going to use Chair's prerogative to put a couple of points to you first. The first is, you know, hundreds of thousands of people are using your services in the next few days, and hundreds of institutions. What are your contingency plans like if something goes wrong? Because, you know, this year decisions may have to be made more swiftly than in some other years.
Sure, and we do, you know, this is not weeks of prep, Nick, this is months and years of preparation. And that's around not just our systems, but of course our systems interact with every individual university systems. And also we provide systems through to teaching advisors. You know, as of Thursday morning, they get access to those key systems. And it's on all sorts of levels. So there's some, you know, you sort of related there to peak volumes and peak loads coming through. We prepare for all that in excess of what we've seen in previous years. The maximum we've seen even on a single results day. If you remember last year, people forget about the last 2 years we've gone through, but it was a single results day last year, which obviously created an even bigger peak. But also things that perhaps wouldn't be necessarily on people's, you know, high on people's agenda, like the you know, cyber attacks and things like that. We saw that in NHS 111 just in the last 2 weeks. So I think all of those things in terms of systems. But the key thing for us is beyond the functionality and the systems working is, can we reach students with some of that pastoral support, either on the phones or through social media channels? And some of the podcasts we've done with Kate Thistleton over the last 2.5 weeks have got massive reach in terms of students and are seen as, you know, when we talk to students about plan Bs and preparing for perhaps if they don't get their grades, people are interacting with that and doing exactly what we think they should be doing when they interact with UCAS.com.
Great, thank you. And then may I also ask you, you know, the big political story at the moment is obviously who becomes our next Prime Minister, and university admissions have been part of the conversation around who will become our next Prime Minister. And I think a lot of us had thought PQA, PQO, all those conversations had gone off the boil a bit, but actually, you know, do you have a response to sort of the political debate around university admissions that's currently going on?
I think, you know, absolutely, as you said, we obviously worked very hard with Universities UK and Guild HE to come up with that post-qualification offer-making model, and then thought that perhaps was it for a while, as you say. Certainly not now was the word from government. I think some of the aspirations of what some of the two leaders have said around guaranteed interviews and things like that are really laudable, because actually you're looking at trying to take some of the most selective institutions and say, how can they be more accessible for all? I think there's a danger getting too hung up on what is the right institution for an individual. We've got such a variety across UKHE. I mean, we would, from a UCAS perspective, we would work with whoever is the next Prime Minister to understand the key thing is the practical implementation and ensuring there's no unintended consequences. As you know, when we did the consultation response, there is a danger that you try to make things better, and actually it's the disadvantage that lose out either over a summer period period or a point in the autumn. So, and also absolutely making sure we're still internationally competitive, because you move everything in a UK context, you could easily make us less internationally competitive.
Thank you. And then final one from me before we go to the floor, because I do want to make sure we have half our total allotted time for questions from the floor. T-levels. This is the first year that people can apply to university with T-levels. I know we're only talking about hundreds of applicants rather than tens of thousands, but can you say something about what the experience might be like for them?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's about 1,300 overall T-level students, 1,400, and we've seen nearly 500 of those look to progress to higher education. Actually, when we looked at the sorts of institutions that they are progressing to, really mixed in terms of a set of institutions. You've got some very high selective institutions, some small specialist institutions. So quite encouraging to see a blend of different institutions in there. And actually, in terms of offer rates for those nearly 500 students, that's also very encouraging at the moment. So it's one we'll try and bring out on Thursday in terms of where they end up post results when they're announced.
Great. Thank you, Claire. I'm now going to go to the Q&A from the floor. Much the most popular question so far is one from James Seymour, who is at the University of Gloucestershire. But do introduce yourself, James. Your microphone should now be on.
Hi, Claire. Good morning, everybody. So yeah, I put my question in the chat. So this year, the sector had a high number of applicants who did not accept any of their offers, or indeed were unplaced in mid-June. And we had emails from UCAS quoting this at 91,000, and many of us will concur with that. Good to get us insight, please, into what these applicants are intending to do, and also whether we can learn from that in the context of our dates and deadlines for 2023 cycle, when we say we predict things will genuinely return back to a sense of normality. Thanks.
James, great to hear from you. Just down the road from me, so I know James very well. And interesting you've asked about dates and deadlines, because we've had that conversation before, James. What I would say is it is changing dynamically, that number, almost every single day. So as we sit here today, it's nowhere near that number. But what we are seeing is a combination of, if I take you back to that stat, James, of 97.5% have got at least one offer. You've got a combination of then students declining and saying, actually, I want to hold on till I see what I get on Thursday. You've got combinations of people who've declined my place and have actually chosen something else. So you've got a combination of people looking at apprenticeships, and we are seeing that as an alternative route that they are parallel using at the moment. So there's varying different things, and we're getting better and better, James, at analysing on ucas.com what pages individuals are looking at, and the clearing pages are by far the most popular. So the sort of messages that we've been putting out around the nearly 30,000 courses in there, that there is a real selection still, that you should have a plan B, seem to be working. And that's where the majority of people who perhaps are not sitting on that firm offer at the moment are going, is looking at those clearing pages. In terms of your second part of your question, James, around dates and deadlines and as a return to normal, one of the things we've done, we've worked really hard at this, is to try and normalise some of those dates and deadlines rather than the sort of ad hoc, sometimes it arrives on a Sunday, an application deadline, stuff like that. So, and also in terms of those reject by default, decline by default deadlines, which are a bit of university terminology, university admissions terminology, but effectively those points by which a student needs to respond to offers, etc. So normalising those as much as we can. And also, James, because I know you're going to ask, making sure that we are fully equipped for multiple start dates as well. So you sort of January starts and things like that, which is absolutely top of certainly my priorities as we prepare for things like lifelong loan entitlements and stuff like that. So quite a bit in your question. Hopefully I've unpacked it there, James.
Thank you, Claire. There may be a question on the lifelong loan entitlement coming up, looking at the list, but I'm going to go to Paul Woodgates next, whose question has also been upvoted by lots of people. Paul, I think your mic's now on.
Thank you. Paul Woodgates. I'm an independent consultant and a governor at De Montfort University. Thanks very much, Claire. Really interesting talk. I wanted to just ask whether you think that this year's cycle has been impacted by the continuing limitation of the fee in England to 9,250 and the impact of inflation on that, meaning that purportedly lots of universities are now finding that teaching UK home undergraduates is a loss-making activity, and therefore focusing more on international recruitment, potentially at the expense of the number of places available to home students. I wonder if you think that's having an impact this year.
So I think there's two parts to the question to that, Paul. It's a great question. I think from a data perspective, we can't see that sort of international students, edging out UK students. That's just not happening at a macro level data. Anecdotally, there are a couple of universities where they're looking at, at a course level. So I wouldn't even say at a university-wide level, what's the blend of UK international? Absolutely, I've heard a couple of anecdotes of that. I do think, Paul, though, it's one to watch for future years, particularly in terms of that 9250 and the value of that 9250 as it moves forward. So was not an issue for this year. I think rightfully you're looking, 2-3 years time, and particularly for UK 18-year-olds, there still isn't the supply side in terms of some of those alternative options that I discussed as well. So I think it's one to watch, but not a macro level issue this year.
Claire, given that absolutely nobody is exempt from the cost of living pressures and the cost of running an organisation, as well as causing problems to universities, does it mean you will need to raise your fees for people who use your services?
So we do an annual review of our application fees and also what we call capitation fees, so services to universities. We try and keep that as low as possible and then reinvest it all back into services. We usually do that about November, December. To be quite honest, Nick, I'm not going to preempt that today. We'll do it in the context of how the economy looks in November, December. But they're not significant numbers, less than £30 for a student to apply through UCAS. So I'm pretty confident that, if it is a rise, it's usually in the 50p, 25p sort of domain.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to Peter Brandt now, which is the question on the lifelong loan entitlement. Peter, do introduce yourself.
Hi, Claire. Peter Brandt, Open University. So as you alluded to, a big focus for the UK government is encouraging more flexible study and more mature students accessing HE via interventions like the lifelong loan entitlement. And while I know UCAS only covers full-time students, and so it's a sort of partial look, what's happened to demand from mature students during this cycle, and are there any signs of a cost of living crisis having any impact on discouraging them?
Yeah, there's a few bits to unpack in there. Firstly, in terms of mature students, because that was sort of like, I suppose, the direct end of your question. If you look at the 2022 versus 2021 data, it does show a decrease in those aged 21 plus. However, I would say that is slightly skewed by the fact that we had a massive increase in mature students over 2020 and 2021, primarily driven by nursing applicants. There was a big sort of reaction to, the power of the NHS during the pandemic years and a rise in those nursing applicants, which tend to be mature. So if you look at 2022 in mature applicants versus 2019, it's actually a more positive picture. So I think that's the direct question you asked. However, I feel behind your question was, and how do we, as a sector, prepare for things like more micro-credentials, modular learning, and lifelong loan entitlement, or whatever that might be called, as we move to 2025. And I do think it relates somewhat to James's question earlier on, which is about how we get a much more flexible system where it's not so much driven just by this autumn start date, and people can come in and out of education, and there are short courses available to them to do that. So that's the first thing, and that's UCAS working with the rest of the sector. The second thing is, if we're just circulating the same people around UK higher education, we've probably missed the point, and trying to get into some of those harder to reach groups. And I think back to my county council days, who actually have probably never considered doing, an engineering course or a Microsoft Excel course, and how we bring those into our educational landscape, I think is probably the even bigger challenge. But I know that wasn't directly your question, but in the same context.
Thank you, Claire. I'm struck, not surprised, but nonetheless struck by how often cost of living is coming up today. And of course, one other factor that people advising people have to take into account is that the whole student finance package changes for people who go to university in 2023. So I don't know, I'll give you the chance to come back on that if you want to in a moment. But let's go to another member of the audience, Dennis Sherwood. His question has now been upvoted by quite a lot of people. Dennis has a new book out about GCSE and A-level grading. Dennis, over to you.
Good morning, and thank you. I'd like to refer to yesterday's letter signed by both Ofqual and UCAS, which has had quite a lot of publicity. In the very first bullet point, it says your grade will be determined solely on the basis of your work, which is very reassuring and gives the student a great sense of agency. It's what the student does that determines the outcome. But I'm a bit puzzled because not so long ago, Ofqual published a blog which said it is possible for two examiners to give different but appropriate marks to the same answer, which I read as saying that if there are two possible marks, they might be on different sides of a grade boundary, resulting in different grades. So I'm puzzled. I can't see how those two statements are simultaneously true, and I was wondering what it is I'm not understanding properly. Thank you.
Nick, do you want me to come on to that, and then I'll come back to the loan arrangement changes?
Yes, do, yeah.
So I think, Dennis, I certainly, I think the intent of the letter, and I'll come back to the specific statement that you're talking about in a minute, is that we, between myself and Ofqual, as the two organisations, UCAS and Ofqual, are looking to reassure students. And I think there is something about responsible organisations at this time, particularly in the 2 weeks leading up to results day, looking at the data available to them, and Ofqual will have a set of data available to it, and we will have a set of data available to us, and other organisations might be looking at different data and saying, what are we seeing, and what is the message to students? And between the two organisations, we are seeing a set of exam grades, a set of potential firm choices and first choices, and people getting into those, where actually we are confident about Thursday. And therefore the intent of the letter, and I hope this got over to students and parents, was to reassure that everybody was working in their best interests. If I go to your first comment and triangulating with something else Ofqual said, UCAS's role is not to reap through everything that Ofqual said and say one person said this and one other person said that and what is the truth. Ultimately, what Joe as chief regulator was trying to do was reassure students that you will be marked on the basis of your work. I'm not going to speculate about triangulating that with someone else from Ofqual said potentially a year or two ago. So I'm just not going to get involved in that. I think in terms of, and I'm going to pick up on something that isn't Dennis's question, but Nick asked me to touch on, which is something we're seeing from students in terms of sentiment about the loan arrangements changing next year, because of course they do change next year, both in terms of that trigger at which they're paid back and the period over which they are paid back. We are not seeing from all our survey work students that impacting students' choices this year. We're not seeing that we're seeing much more concern from them about groceries, about accommodation and energy costs, and about course materials than anything to do with loan arrangement changes next year. That may change, and obviously we'll be tracking, number of deferrals and what happens there. At the moment, they're actually reduced from this time last year. So, it may change come this time next week or in a couple of weeks' time, but certainly at the moment, it's more immediate concerns that are worrying students.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to Michael Nattler's question in a moment, but I'm conscious that every single question so far has been asked by a man. So I'm going to move down the list a little bit and go to Julie Kelly, and then we'll go to Janet Murphy. Julie.
Hi, Claire. Hi, Nick. Yeah, just a quick one. We talked earlier about these sort of unplaced students, and there was a feeling, I think it was Data HE actually on Twitter made some commentary earlier in the cycle about potentially there was a mismatch between what students sort of predicted grades and what schools and colleges have been advising them this year, perhaps not really realising that this year was going to be this midpoint recalibration. So it just made me wonder, bearing in mind next year will be more tricky, and that the feeling that he had of course saying, it's going to go back to more like 2019 year. I just wondered what the sort of comms plan was for schools and colleges.
Yeah, sure. And nice to speak to you, Julie. So I think, again, I'm not sure whether it's helpful to speculate. The universities, and this, have known about the midpoint. And I think the offer making that we've seen has been really responsible, actually, because they've been very aware of that midpoint as they have made offers. I think in terms of your point about comms and more importantly, engagement with teachers and advisors, you know, a lot of those predicted grades will be made back in January, but we have been working week in, week out with teachers and advisors in this cycle on webinars, individual schools and colleges, to say, actually, how do you support them through in terms of expectation setting and doing plan Bs as they go through? Your point about next year, I agree with the sentiment behind your point that in terms of 2023, obviously we've got a return back, so we're past the midpoint, and we've got, remember, that 3% demographic increase, and potentially we could see also an application rate of UK 18-year-olds increase again from that 44%. So I do think there's more for us to do, if this is what you're intimating, in terms of as we enter the 2023 cycle, which I'm sure everybody on the webinar knows has already opened, and actually students can pay and send their application from September. There will be more for us to do as we work with teachers and schools and they submit their applications either to the October or the January deadline, and that's very much, we're very cognizant of that.
Thank you, Claire. I'm going to go to, as I said, Janet Murphy, who's got a question about T-levels, which we've covered a little bit already. And then I'm going to go straight, before we go back to you, Claire, to Helen Carasso, who's also got a question. And I'll give you the chance to respond to those 2 points. And then I'll go to Michael Natzler, and then I'm afraid we're going to be pretty much out of time. So Janet, over to you.
Hi, apologies, I'll make this brief. I have got COVID at the moment, so I'm not talking very well. Really, it's sort of anecdotally, we're a college that piloted with the T-levels, and there's a couple of issues that we've sort of been aware of. One is the sort of the universities, how they publicise their entry requirements for T-levels on their own websites and on UCAS. But also sort of anecdotally, some of our students who've spoken to representatives from universities who have been very unaware overall of T-levels. I think that's a piece of work for universities to do with it, maybe with their school liaison staff. But it's a piece of work that we do at the beginning of our enrolment period every year around having to contact individual universities that we know our students apply to get some clarity on their feelings about T-levels and their entry requirements. So I don't know whether you can answer that, Claire, but it's something we are becoming more increasingly aware of. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet, and good luck with recovering from COVID, which none of us envy you on. Helen Carasso, who's at the University of Oxford, I'm just going to go to. Don't know if that was one of the universities Janet had in mind when she was asking her question, but Helen.
Hi, hello, yes, yes, formerly Director of Undergraduate Admissions at Oxford, but a while ago now. Thanks for this, Claire. I mean, you mentioned that underrepresented groups you felt were being treated consistently and well in this cycle, and that even though it was more competitive, you felt that the numbers of people from those groups were getting a reasonable chance to get fair offers. We know about contextual offers, but we're all increasingly under pressure with the APP and the measurements, rightly so, to check that students don't just get in, but get on. So what do you think are there examples you can think of things beyond the obvious contextual offer that are more interesting and creative ways that universities are making those offers that you think are fair and consistent and others should be looking at?
Great question. Great, but two really good questions. So can I take both of those, Nick? Yeah. So Janet, to your question about T-levels, we did a huge amount of work this year with universities to make them more aware of T-levels, what the content was, to work on getting information on their website so it's transparent to those T-level students. We will continue that, Janet, as we go through the next year, because quite frankly, it is a new qualification. And so I think there's going to be a bit of a taking a couple of years to really get that as transparent as we would like to see for students on websites. I think a lot of universities, I can think of, at least a handful locally, who've been really active in terms of saying, this is how we value the T-level. That doesn't mean, Janet, that it's got to all universities. And I think you're thinking probably a couple I could also name, but won't. We will do more as we go through the next cycle. So not a closed book, I would say. The second question is slightly more complex, Helen, in terms of widening participation and how how we do innovative things in terms of contextualization. You know, universities will want people who succeed on their courses, won't they? So I think one of the things we are actively working with admissions professionals across the UK on is not just the widening participation questions and data that we've introduced for 2023, which I think is groundbreaking, and we already know, given the cycles opened back in May, there's tens of thousands of students who are disclosing some of those data points. The second thing we can do is encourage disclosure ourselves as UCAS, so make sure that actually if you're an estranged student, you know the benefit of saying you're an estranged student when you come through. But also reform of basic things, Helen, like the personal statement, like the reference, to make sure that the university, particularly in some of what we call near-miss candidates, where you might want to be just saying, oh, the grades aren't quite there, but tell me something else about the student, that the personal statement is not what it is at the moment, which is a sort of 47 lines, you know, several thousand characters, and, you know, a blank sheet of paper, so that we can help students work through that and give the most appropriate information, but also the reference, which of course we're introducing changes on that already, which can talk, a teacher advisor can talk about extenuating circumstances rather than the reference being something about the school or college. So I think there's quite a lot of different ways as we move for the next couple of years that we as UCAS can work with universities and teacher advisors to really ensure that those disadvantaged students, that the progress continues, they don't get left behind. We're also thinking about how we link disadvantaged students to some of the outreach that universities and some of the third sector organisations do as well, so some sort of outreach connections engine. So lots, happy to update you in more detail offline, Helen, but lots going on.
Thank you, Claire. I also wonder if some of that is partially an answer to Dennis Sherwood's question about the weight put on grades, which may or may not be as reliable as people sometimes assume. So I'm just going to beg for everybody's patience, because we're going to run over by just a couple of minutes, because I would like to fit in the final question that's been upvoted by quite a lot of people. It brings an international perspective to our conversations, which is Michael, my former colleague, actually, Michael Natley, who now works for Nous Group. Michael.
Thanks, Nick and Claire. Yeah, I'll keep it quick. So with more than 100,000 Hong Kong, British national overseas citizens having arrived in the UK by the start of this year, what data insight do UCAS have around BNO holders applying to higher education this year? And in connection, I'm aware UCAS is collecting more data around displacement and refugee status students. What trends have you seen here for applications and outcomes, especially in light of Ukraine and Afghanistan? Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Claire.
So taking the second part of your question first, and then coming back to the first part, I think it's probably too early to say on the refugee status and asylum seeker status, simply because there's a lot of questions in terms of the disclosure we're seeing come through for 2023. So watch this space, Michael, in terms of 2023. I think broader on the international perspective, which is what you were looking for earlier, I think one of the things, you know, we will obviously publish data on this on Thursday, but even at the end of the main cycle, one of the things we were highlighting was that increase of 10% in China, and some countries emerging. So if you think about your Nigerias, your Ghanas, your Vietnam, some of those countries, significant 100% increases, but still small numbers. So one of the things that we're working with organisations like Universities UK on is actually how do we collectively, you know, the British Council as well, collectively go to some of those markets and encourage take-up, because, you know, there is a significant Chinese presence in that international application market, and I'm not undermining that in any way. That's an important part of what makes us attractive as UKHE, but it might be good to see in 3, 4, 5 years time that more balanced out with other parts of the world that we haven't got good take up of UKHE at the moment. So I'm hoping that was your question, Michael. If it was specifically about Hong Kong, I'm more than happy to take that offline.
Well, thank you, Claire. I mean, I think it's so wonderful you've been able to end and start actually with positives about demand for UK higher education, both from home and overseas, because 2 years ago, in the depth of COVID, people were predicting all sorts of horrors. And if anything, of course, the pandemic's shown people value education even more than they did beforehand. So I'm going to call a halt to proceedings now, 3 minutes over, for which I apologise. But Claire, thank you so much for doing this yet again. I think you've covered a huge amount of ground. And thank you also to your colleagues at UCAS, who are always a joy to deal with when setting this session up. People like Ben, Jordan and John Cope and others in your office that we've dealt with. And thank you also to my colleagues at HEPI, Emma, who has been behind the scenes making sure this morning goes smoothly. It's not even meant to work on Mondays for HEPI, so particularly grateful to her. And thank you all for listening in. If you want to listen back or encourage your colleagues to watch this session or listen to it, we will be putting it up on our website later today. And good luck if you're waiting for your results this week. I hope it works out for you and your students. Many thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.